You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by David Brin. David Brin is a scientist, speaker, technical consultant, and world-known author. His novels have been New York Times bestsellers, winning multiple Hugo, Nebula, and other awards. A 1998 movie directed by Kevin Costner was loosely based on his book, The Postman. He earned his PhD in physics from UCSD, followed by a master's in optics, and an undergraduate degree in astrophysics from Caltech. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the California Space Institute and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Brin serves on advisory committees dealing with subjects as diverse as national defense and homeland security, astronomy, space exploration, SETI and nanotechnology, future prediction, and philanthropy. He has served since 2010 on the Council of External Advisors for NASA's Innovative and Advanced Concepts Group, which supports the most inventive and potentially groundbreaking new endeavors. Remember to subscribe to Event Horizon so you never miss an episode.
David Brin, welcome back to the program.
Oh, well, always great to talk to one of the best audiences around.
Fantastic audience, fantastic.
And of course, you are responsible, you and your team, like Ross, are responsible for attracting such an audience. So I'm not going to be quelling or oversimplifying this time.
You don't have to, not with this.
That's right.
Not with this audience. I always assume a scientifically literate audience.
All right.
And it always works. David, I have a big question that's been eating at me for weeks, and I didn't mention this in our emails. The Great Silence. You coined that term, didn't you? Which is something I've uttered on the internet about 15 billion times. And back in 1983.
Yeah. Well, in 1983, I had the good fortune, I had just finished my PhD at UCSD. I had the good fortune in 82 to attend the first interstellar migration conference in Los Alamos. And Michael Hart was there and Ben Finney. And it was actually a very small conference, but it was about the whole question of the Hart hypothesis, which was an extension of the von Neumann notion that self-replicating probes would make the whole question of whether or not there should be aliens within reach absurd, because these probes should be able to go between solar systems. One probe arrives at a solar system, mines asteroids, makes a bunch of daughter probes, fills them up, sends them on to more star systems, and then hangs around and lurks and waits for something interesting to happen in that solar system. Well, by that logic, they calculated, Hart and Finney and some of the others calculated that the galaxy should fill with such probes within just 3 million years. That's an eye blink. In fact, Finney is an expert on Polynesian migrations. He used Polynesia as a template for how long it would take human settlers on an Earth-like world to build up their industry to be able to send on more colony ships, just 10% of the speed of light. And that calculation worked out to 60 million years to fill the galaxy. So obviously something's wrong. And I started ruminating on that and realized that there was a pattern. And my friend Frank Drake, the late Frank Drake, did his famous Drake equation, which by itself is actually not very good for calculation, but it worked out to a way to systematize just our thoughts about where the problem might be. And I added contact cross-section. I mean, you're not likely to see some kinds of aliens. And that's a whole category that you and Isaac Arthur and some others have been talking about extensively. But in 1983, I submitted a paper to the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society that they featured very soon. And there I did the first attempt to categorize according to an expanded Drake equation that included the expansion, because Frank assumed that all the alien advanced races would stay in the solar system where they started. And so I included factors for including the colonies that they might make, and also the contact cross-section, some of these things. And I called it the problem of the Great Silence. And yeah, so you've been quoting correctly. And then about 5 years after that, I forget the paper, but somebody decided that it would be cute to credit it to Enrico Fermi, and the name stuck. It's neither a paradox nor is it Fermi's, but we have a lot of those in the language, and we just plunge ahead.
Yeah, I believe Fermi. His quote is, "Where are they?" And that that was about it. The Fermi question.
The Fermi question works, but on the other hand, you know, he did a lot of stuff and was a very great mind.
Oh, he was one of the luminary physicists, but I don't know that he put a lot of thought into the Fermi Paradox. I think that was over lunch.
Yeah.
And that was the extent of it, because I don't think he ever published anything about it, as far as I know.
No. Hart was the one who, in the late 70s, pushed the notion that we must be alone because we don't see anybody. Von Neumann poked at it before that, and a few of the others, but we've moved on to more sophistication in our puzzlement.
Do you have, after all this time, a gut feeling on what the solution to the Fermi Paradox is?
Well, I rank them in order. I think one of the terrible mistakes to make is to declare, this is the thing. This is my belief. No, I think that you can rank order the hypotheses. So my top hypothesis is that human beings are anomalously smart and nice. That seems bizarre, especially in this election season, as the United States of America is deciding whether to be smart or nice at all, and take the world with it, as it has for the last 80 years, in whatever direction the voters of the United States choose. But setting that aside, if you take a look at how long it took to create metazoan life on Earth, and then to create life that's capable of a dawning sapience and introducing technologies that could shape their own future, there is a period of time between about 20,000 years ago and the present, pretty much, or at least the last 200 years, when this primitive species was already destroying the Earth. Now, hurricanes, as we speak, unprecedented hurricanes, are ravaging the Caribbean Gulf Coast because the Caribbean's temperature is higher than it's ever been, to the best of our knowledge, for reasons that are blatantly obvious to anybody who pays any attention. So clearly we can affect the Earth, but this goes back way farther than our industrial civilization, even the burning of coal. As soon as we became ferocious enough to protect herds of goats from predators, the goat population expanded all across Eurasia pyrotechnically. And everywhere that goats were herded, the hillsides got denuded and deserts spread. Then you go to irrigation, and we found out some very interesting things about irrigation. Most of the places where we learned how to irrigate and grow more food became deserts, but not all of them. There's a fair number that have been irrigated constantly for 5,000 years and are still fertile. And if you take a look at the difference between those two areas, it has one trait, and that is drainage. So if you irrigate and you don't drain off the salts that you've added to the soil, you're going to kill the farms for your great-great-grandchildren. But if there's good drainage on terraced slopes, for example, then you can, with good practice, keep it going. In any event, with irrigation and goat herds, we were already ravaging this planet. Soon after, we killed whales, and the whales turn out to be primary ecosystem elements in our oceans, and certain patches of the ocean are recovering now because whale populations are recovering. So here are three areas in which a very primitive, sapient tool-using species was destroying its planet. Now imagine that that just continues for 80,000 years instead of 4,000 years, for 100,000 years, while technology advances very, very slowly, as it did under feudalism, advancing very slowly. Well, what you've got is a species that by the time they got the science to see what they had done to their world, the deed is done. They've already spoiled paradise, and there's very little that they can use to become a star-faring civilization. So that's a long way of explaining why I think that it may be that we lucked out and got this narrow window of opportunity to be a scientific civilization that's capable of tending and taking care of a planet before it's ruined, and therefore use its resources to get the far more copious resources of the solar system. There's one more reason why I believe in this theory, well, at least I think it's my leading theory, and that is male reproductive strategies. If you look all across mammalia, and in fact most metazoan species, the reproductive strategy of males to prevent other males from breeding warps the behavioral patterns of those species. It can manifest as bower birds spending resources on making nests to attract females. It can be antlers, it can be giant peacock tails, or it can be what we see now in the genetic record happened 8,000 years ago, when there was a period of a few centuries in which all across Eurasia, only 7% of the males got to breed. And it happens to coincide with the arrival of agriculture, beer, and kings, and the ability to prevent, to basically take the women of other men. And we see this manifested also in the Americas, where across most of Latin America, the mitochondria in almost all of the population of Latin America is descended from Native American females. But the Y chromosome, the male line, is European. And I guess I don't have to explain to this audience what that implies. Our last 200 years of the Enlightenment have involved putting constraints on the male reproductive strategy, which is called feudalism, that dominated most of the previous 10,000 years. And the fact that we're capable, now that doesn't mean we're going to, this is in part what this election is about, but the fact that we have proved we're capable of, encouraged and demanded by our females, of a large fraction of our males curbing this tendency may be rare across the galaxy. Okay, so there's number one. Number two segues into another topic that I know you want to talk about, and that is the fact that the Earth skates the very inner edge of our continuously habitable zone around our sun. Now, a lot of your listeners don't know about the Goldilocks zone and the Gaia balance, where a continuously habitable zone, where a planet is in that zone, determines the amount of carbon dioxide it can stand in its atmosphere. Because the Gaia balance is such that it maintains the ocean. Because if the CO2 level gets too low, a planet with tectonics and oceans will put in more CO2, or rather the CO2 will accumulate from the constant volcanism. And if the CO2 rises too high, you get a lot of weathering of the continents, which sends minerals into the ocean, which pulls out CO2 as carbonates. Now, this is how Earth did it. This is how our mother world mostly did it. And life only supplements this with photosynthetic plankton taking carbon out. It's mostly a non-living process. If Mars had been larger and had plate tectonics and oceans, it would, according to this hypothesis, and it's fairly well grounded, have oceans right now. Mars's tragedy is not how far it was from the sun, but how small it is. If Mars had been Earth-like, we'd be able to go down and surf with the natives, except we'd have to wear masks all the time because it would have reached a Gaia balance with a very dense carbon dioxide atmosphere. We skate so close to the inner edge of the continuously habitable zone of our sun that our planet can only afford as much CO2 as plants need, and really no more. And that's going to change. It's changing as we speak. Segue.
Now, a common question or comment I get is that, well, you're not going to terraform Venus, you're not going to terraform Mars, and I disagree with that. But the fact is, we have been terraforming this planet, as you just illustrated, for thousands of years. We are changing this world on a major scale, which means that you can. The question is, at what point do you take control of it? And I worry about this because is planet change and terraforming the solution to the Fermi paradox? Is that no one survives it or few survive it?
Well, there's a paper out recently that simulated almost any alien civilization is going to destroy their world with climate change. And it's a complete bull paper because it assumes endless 1% growth rate. And look, we've already proved we can control our appetites. Oh yeah, there's a third factor for why we might be different. And that is our females are capable of switching from high R to high K reproductive strategies with great alacrity. So for most of human history, women, well, one can argue they had no choice in the matter, but in any event, they pumped out babies until they died. But what we have seen across this planet in the last 60 years is that when they know that there's a very high likelihood that a couple of kids are going to do well and survive, they switch the strategy to, I just want two, or even, as we see in a lot of nations today, one. And the fact that they are capable of doing that may be one of the factors that enables us to cross this next period and save this world. Because certainly the decline in the skyrocketing growth of human population is one of the major things that gives us a chance. Having said that, you mentioned Terraforming Venus. I have a novella that I turned into a screenplay. Any of you folks out there? Love story set under the oceans of Venus. Now, none of you listening probably are old enough to remember how crushed we were in 1962 by NASA. The Mariner 2 space probe went past Venus and told us, no, the clouds are not water clouds, and there aren't oceans and jungles under there with beautiful princesses wearing skimpy brass garments. It was traumatic. We adjusted to it, but I went ahead and wrote a story set several thousand years after we pummeled Venus with comets, because that we could in theory do, because it takes a very little delta V for a robot to grab a comet out there and change its trajectory so that it will fall onto Venus. That supplies a lot of water. If you have some of them do near misses, you can drag away some of the carbon dioxide and sulfuric acid. If you have the impact be at the right angle, you can speed up Venus's day. And so eventually you might be able to have those wonderful oceans there. I'd love to see it. Mars, there's been a lot more attention paid to how you could terraform Mars, and I cannot recommend the Mars trilogy by my friend Kim Stanley Robinson. Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars. By the way, Stan has become extremely influential recently with his recent book, The Ministry of the Future. Supposedly, there are people at the UN who would like to establish an agency named after that, the Ministry for the Future. In other words, start using our prefrontal lobes to plan ahead. Those little nubs above the eyes that are the only organ we have that no other mammal has, no other animal has. So what Stan accomplished, Kim Stanley Robinson accomplished with Ministry for the Future is what I tried to accomplish with my novel Earth. For a while there, people called it the Moby Dick of the Whole Earth movement, but it's largely forgotten now, even though I think it makes some good points.
Now, to go further with terraforming, and the interesting thing, because not only did we get it, we got a double whammy when we found that Venus wasn't a jungle world, but we also found around that time that Mars wasn't either, and that Mars was, there's no canal builders there, right? But
no canals.
Well,
no canals.
There is an aspect of this, though, that honestly, and this plays very much into the Fraser Paradox, that creeps me out, because what we did find out was that Mars is showing abundant evidence of once having had liquid water for a long time. And then there are some hypotheses that Venus may have had it too. That is 3 water worlds, surface water worlds in one star system at some point in the past. Earth held on to it.
More than that. It's very likely that toward the beginning, some of the ice-roofed worlds were...
Of which we've got like 20 at this point. Well, suspected ice shelf.
20 is hypothetical. We know for sure 6 or 7, and it seems highly plausible the number may be up to 10 or 12. What this means is you look up at the sky, and it's likely that 99 or 95% of the twinkles that you see have water environments, ice-roofed moons, because you see, these don't need no Goldilocks zone. As long as the solar system is extensive enough that planets can form beyond the frost line and gather moons, it's very likely that there is a planet with a moon, or maybe the planet itself, if it's small, like Pluto, that has an ice-roofed ocean. And if we find out, as I would give, 70% odds that making life is actually pretty easy, then that means you look at the sky, almost every twinkle has life. So I've spent 12 years as an advisor to NASA's Innovative and Advanced Concepts Program, NIAC, and among the endeavors that we gave grants to were some that would create drilling systems down to the ocean of Europa, or cave climbers that could climb down crevices. And so this is going to be something very exciting that we may find out within the next 20, 30, maybe 40 years. But then when you get right down, and even Titan, probably the most amazing place in our solar system, with liquid lakes of methane and ethane, down under their hard rock, which is ice, water ice, is likely another of these buried oceans. Wow.
Well, wow, especially since you can play with ideas with Titan of a subsurface ice shell ocean under there.
Yeah.
Covered by a completely different potential biosphere in the hydrocarbon part of it on the surface, because you can envision low temperature life. And so you could have 2A biogenesis on Titan.
Oh, I was working on a short story at some point. I may return to it at some point, where humans land on Titan and the wax beings are terrified of us because they've been fighting a war with these fiery volcano creatures that come out, and they realize that we are made of molten lava, also molten lava called water. And we finally communicate with them and say, oh, no, we meet those guys all the time. You're special, you're unique, we'll defend you.
Lava primates.
Yeah, that's who we are. We're made of lava. But there is something that happened when I was working on my PhD. I worked for Hannes Alfvén, the Nobel Prize winner, who invented plasma physics. And he and Gustav Arrhenius, who is the grandson of the famous Arrhenius, they came up with a very interesting insight. And that is, when the solar system formed, triggered by a nearby supernova, That supernova seeded our cloud with many elements, some of them radioactive, including aluminum 26. And that has a short to intermediate life, half-life. And we now are pretty sure that there's tens of billions of comets out there. And they sort of peak around the same size, 1 to 50 kilometers, generally around, 2, 3, 4, 5. My doctoral dissertation was about comets, by the way. So now you have these billions of comets of a fairly compact but appreciable size. And there's all this aluminum 26 inside of them, giving off heat. Well, their surface quickly cools, radiating to space. So you have these ice test tubes, these liquid zones with salty water inside, protected by ice shells, and passing through the magnetic field and electrical field of a condensing protostar. How could you possibly name a better reactor test tube for the precursors of life, since there's all sorts of organics there as well? And you have billions of them. I don't think that there's an awful lot of, no matter how unlikely the spark you believe it is, tens to hundreds of billions of these reactor vessels sounds like it could overcome even unlikelihood. So I hope I've offered you a few things that weren't discussed before.
Yeah, and so it could also simply be that the Great Silence isn't against life. It's against complexity. So what is your view on the idea of ice shell worlds having life, but it being locked in? They don't even know space is out there, and that it's forced simplicity.
Well, I think you're completely right to raise that point. I believe that just as we found about 25 years ago that one of the factors of Drake's equation, the number of planets, became a non-issue, that planets are everywhere. I believe, I give 3/4 probability that life is everywhere. Now, if you take, and it appeared on Earth almost as soon as the seas cooled enough. But metazoan life had to wait until my friend Joe Kirschvink's Iceball Earth happened. Recall that I said that the inner edge of the continuously habitable zone of our solar system is migrating outward. Well, about 1 billion years ago, it was considerably farther in. And the peregrinations of climate, Joe discovered that there was a period when the Earth was virtually covered, possibly with openings at the equator, by ice everywhere. And then subsequently discovered that this happened 2 or 3 times. But after the last time, almost immediately, you had the burst of metazoan life, leading to the Great Cambrian explosion. But that was after the Earth had been covered with life for 3 billion years. So that step appears to be a more difficult one. I'm quite frankly amazed that there was no panspermia that actually interfered with that. And of course, it's quite possible that the event, when it did burst forth, was a panspermia event. But then it took almost another 1 billion years for this metazoan life to offer something at all like sapiens. And then you get into all the amazing story of the different species of humanity that co-occupied the planet at the same time, the different versions of Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis, the relationships between Neanderthals and Denisovans and humans and from Africa. So you're running into a set of events that might themselves be unlikely. So yeah, I'm certainly willing to posit that the fraction that achieve complex life is not universal, and the fraction that achieve technological sapience may be rare. And as I suggested before, the fraction who achieve technological sapience, who show any sense of self-control, or I would call it F sub W wisdom, I hypothesize, without any evidence other than the male reproductive strategy and what goats and irrigation were doing, that's likely rare too.
Now, goats are a theme. We have come up with a theme for this conversation about goats. Now, in regards to what you were just saying, does that tell you that it's been raised? It's been suggested, right, that we're early in the game as far as sapient life, and that towards the aging of the universe, it will become more and more common, an intelligence explosion. Do you think that's possibly what this is that we're just early in the game?
Oh, I think that there's a real possibility that we may be the ancient ones. It's not the life we would have chosen. We would have chosen to be Captain Kirk, But as a matter of fact, I won a Hugo Award for my short story called "The Crystal Spheres," which folks can find in my best of collection, which I'm sure you'll offer in the description below. Oh, I also offer folks the link to the 3-minute video trailer for Existence. It's way funner than most of the 3-minute things they'll find out there. In any event, in the Crystal Spheres, there is a hypothesis for why we don't find anyone else out there. And sometimes the hypothesis is more artistic than plausible, shall we say. And so this is an example of one that I took off my astrophysicist hat and put on my arty writer hat, because it clearly is not the explanation, but thematically it covers the possibility that we might be just plain early. And I'll offer you a link to my science fiction comedy that's called The Ancient Ones. And that one is also about us being early, but not by as much.
So everybody should check out the links below. There will be plenty of links to David's material, which goes back for, as long as I've been alive. And and all the way, 1980, wasn't it, with Sundiver?
Yeah, 1980 with Sundiver.
What just as an aside question, now I've written 2 novels, but what possessed you to sit down and write a science fiction novel?
Oh, I come from a family of writers going back many generations. Everybody in my family was amazed that I could do math. And then when I went to Caltech for my undergraduate, I realized that no, I can't. I can't at that level of quality. My doctoral dissertation was theoretical, but it's Franciscan level, theory, modeling cometary nuclei and things like that. I did a little bit on the theory of polarized light. I'm not a Jesuit as a scientist. I'm more of a Franciscan, which makes it all the more ironic that Caltech in 2 weeks is going to make me a distinguished alumnus. This I never expected. I lived down the hall from Steve Koonin and Joe Kirschvink and Ken Suslick. Very, very weird. But you take what you can get. No, I always knew I'd be a writer, but I tried to get into the field that I thought was about to give humanity its one chance to be honest people. Because whatever you say about art, whatever you say about writing fiction, it's not, strictly speaking, honest, because you're lying. You're making magical incantations about things that never happened. Now, you can convey what they call truths, and I try to, truths about human nature or the quandaries we face and all those sorts of things. I try to take all that stuff on in artistic ways. But I wanted to join the people. Maybe I was influenced being shown Sputnik that evening in 1957. I wanted to join the people who were actually trying to find out what was true. Like it or not, what's actually verifiably true. And boy, I wanted to be part of that. Well, I figured I'd write on the side and occasionally publish something that would pay for some furniture or a car, while I did my honest best to be a good laborer in the vineyards of science. Well, my second novel, Startide Rising, disabused me of this plan. Civilization grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and said, no, you're not going to be a scientist who writes part-time. You're going to be a writer who does science part-time. Got it? Well, who am I to argue with civilization?
Yeah, well, civilization said, yeah, you're going to write a couple of books, and then you're that's not really going to matter all that much compared to what you do on YouTube.
Well, you write good stuff.
I'm trying right now. I've got another book in the I got one in the cooker, and I'm trying to. It's challenging, but I'm really enjoying doing it.
Well, send me your most recent couple. I'd love to receive them. The other thing is, I've got a couple of YA series, science fiction series. One is Aliens Kidnap a California High School and Live to Regret It. And the other is Only Teenagers Can Teleport through time and space. And in the latter one, I have guest authors. So let me send you the Bible to that one.
You bet. Now, David, the idea of a habitable zone, as we were talking about, before we get to that, I'm going to get to that. And you know where I'm going with it, with talking about moving habitable zones. So we'll get to that. But you got some years on me, and you were around in what was sometimes termed as the golden age of sci-fi. You're a product of that. You were in it. Who did you know? I mean, who did you meet over years? Did you ever meet Heinlein, Clarke, or Asimov?
Well, yeah. I only met Heinlein once, sitting next to him at lunch. I can't find the autograph he signed for me. He indicated that he had heard of me because, I became someone of significance in the field very rapidly. My first book was 80. In the 1984 World Science Fiction Convention, I sort of became, and may this happen to you in your life, I became the guy who wanders down the hall and hears this hushed, it's him. It didn't last, but it's a weird sensation. So Heinlein had heard of me. Asimov, I spoke to a few times, but I had the honor later to be asked by his estate to finish his universe and tie up the loose ends. Now, Greg Bear and Greg Benford and I were the killer bees, and we did the second Foundation trilogy. And Bear's novel and Benford's novel, they're very good, and I refer to them, but they don't meddle with the DNA of Isaac's universe. Whereas I do the last week of Harry Seldon's life after the Foundation people have been exiled to Terminus. He has his greatest adventure. And tied together from the hints that Isaac had left. So I tied together his loose ends, and Janet Asimov seemed to think I did a good job. But I didn't know him well. Clarke, I exchanged letters with, and we co-edited in the 90s something called Project Solar Sail, which by coincidence, this last month, the 21st century edition of Project Solar Sail has been reissued. It's got all Clarke's wonderful stuff, a poem by Bradbury, an introduction by Asimov, but also up to the month science articles about where we stand with light sails. And I knew Robert Forward, probably the only one of the Bach authors, B-A-C-H, who I knew well was Ray Bradbury, was a dear friend of mine, and we went to the same high school 30 years apart. So, I'll give you the link for Project Solar Sail because it's way cool. And the thing about anthologies is you can read them the sections, the chapters in lumps, put it down, come back to it later.
You know, it was interesting. Ray Bradbury, what always interested me about him is what a wide talent. He could write about basically anything. And as a matter of fact, I was just probably 6 months ago reading the Toynbee Convector, and I was just like, this guy's, he's a science fiction author, but he's much broader than that, you know, and can do other things. What's your view on that?
Well, I mean, he would get angry when he was called a fantasy author. He certainly wrote fantasy-ish things at times, but also Anne McCaffrey would get enraged if you called her a fantasy author just because she had dragons and medieval settings. She would say, I'm a science fiction author, because her dragons had been genetically engineered a couple of hundred years before to save the humans on this planet. And the thing that makes a difference between fantasy and science fiction is not the furniture, not the weapons. It's whether or not the lesson people come away from is pro or anti-feudalism. And in Anne's universe, these people who had been knocked down almost to the caves by this tragedy that keeps recurring on their planet, they discover that they had once been mighty beings, capable of star travel, and universities and flush toilets and germ theory of disease, and they want them back. And that is the notion that, to me, separates fantasy and science fiction. And it's why George Lucas has never done any science fiction at all, ever. And I also think Yoda is the most evil character in the history of all human mythology, but we won't go into that.
Yoda hate. Now, David, why is Yoda, in your view, the most evil character in a literary history?
Well, you measure it against the magnitude of the betrayals and the number of victims. And any way you look at the prequels and the sequels of Star Wars, Yoda is directly responsible for the death of trillions, if not possibly quadrillions, of sapient entities across the galaxy. Let's just start with too fearful and he is to be trained. This is the kid we watched doing all those brave things in the first prequel. Too fearful he is? So he assigns the least experienced Jedi Master to raise this instead of doing it himself. What made Anakin angry? Well, Yoda could have prevented it by taking a little bit out of petty cash and buying Anakin's mom, putting her in a nice, safe apartment on Coruscant, and the kid would have one more area of stability. All right, that's nitpicking. How about when Yoda orders almost all of the Jedi into a suicide charge? These are the 007 secret agent, independent investigators across the galaxy, and he orders them all to charge with just swords into an arena filled with laser-wielding enemies where they mostly die. He shows up at that very moment with the clone army that he had ordered and paid for, because those guys on planet Camino are no fools. They would have checked who was paying for that giant clone army. There is no reason to believe that it was anyone other than Yoda. And it goes on and on and on and on. You know, if he had allowed Mace Windu to take just 2 assistants with him, Windu almost ended the whole thing himself, the only Jedi worthy of any respect. But all that and more entertaining rants for you guys to get apoplectically angry at are to be found, guess what? In another Brin book called Star Wars on Trial. I had done a denunciation of Star Wars for one of the earlier online magazines, and I was asked to turn it into a book, but the conceit is that it's a trial book. So we recruited one of Lucas's novelizers to be the defense attorney, and I was the prosecuting attorney. And we called witnesses, various intellects who had a good sense of humor, to be prosecution or defense witnesses on 7 accusations against Star Wars. So most of the text is these essays by various sundry people making accusations and then defenses. But in between the chapters, Matthew Woodring Stover and I had fun transcripting us challenging each other before the droid judge, making objections and all that sort of thing. And it was way fun and very popular at the time. But I think the book is 10, 15 years old. But it still contains my fundamental point of comparing the ships in Star Wars to the ships in Star Trek. And what that tells you about the cosmology and the morality of these two very interesting universes, where the ship in Star Wars is a World War I fighter plane banking against non-existent air. The fighter pilot with his silk scarf is like Don Quixote or Achilles with their squires or gunners, and there's no room for the Republic on such a tiny ship. It's not involved. I defy anybody to find anything in any of the Star Wars canon, well, the main movies, in which the Republic does anything. I'm not talking about doing it incompetently. I'm talking about doing anything. And yet on the Enterprise, that's like the ships of Captain Cook. One episode they're doing diplomacy, another they're fighting, another they're doing science. And the Federation is always a passenger and usually a topic aboard the Enterprise. That's very, very different. And it's far more fundamentally different than whether you use lasers or phasers. Anyway, so much for that. John Michael will have a link.
Will indeed. And okay, did you annoy George Lucas? Did you ever hear from him over that book?
If I annoyed him, it could explain why a couple of Hollywood deals went belly up suddenly. But you know what? Hollywood deals go belly up anyway. So I'm not going to flatter myself that I even drew his attention. We'll just have to see.
I was always more of a Star Trek fan, and as you were talking about, but the thing is, the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars is the fundamental vision. I think George Lucas was looking for making a Saturday matinee, an old time, good fun story and all that stuff, whereas Gene Roddenberry seemed to be trying to paint a vision of the future that either worked or it didn't. But what do you think about the modern state of these franchises? You still watching Star Trek? You still watching Star Wars, the new stuff? I actually liked The Mandalorian, at least for a while.
Not very much. I'm not watching it very much. I'm in my later years and I just don't have much time. I've developed 2 YA series, science fiction series, because I want to pay forward. And I don't think kids have enough science fiction that portrays them being a success and humanity being a success. So one of the YA series, I partner with young writers and write myself, and that's the Sky Horizon series. The premise is that aliens kidnap a California high school and live to regret it. The other series, we just found a home for the new novels. Open Road is about to, at the end of October 2024, republish the first 5. And these are the Out of Time novels. And I've been curating these from a bunch of young authors, though the first couple were done by Nebula winners, Nancy Kress and Sheila Finch. But the premise of this is that there's time travel and interstellar travel, but only teenagers can teleport through space and time. So they've got to do all the heavy lifting, all the diplomacy, all the fighting, all the, exploring and all of that. And they can age out wherever they happen to be. And they need help. And so a genius turns it into a time snatcher device, and they reach back across time for heroes who they know can solve problems, even though they aren't yet the people who go down in history. For instance, one that's going to come out soon, they reach back and snatch a 15-year-old Arthur Conan Doyle from the streets of Edinburgh. Even though it's long before he writes Sherlock Holmes, they know he can solve puzzles. So he comes into the future to temporarily help them to solve a dire problem. So those are a couple of the things that I've been working on. And whereas I prefer Star Trek, and I liked Rogue One, by the way, the one that didn't.
Oh, Rogue One was good. Yeah.
It didn't have any Jedi. The stories are all cycling around and around and around and around so much that, I've been there. Who has the time? I'll go for much more interesting little bits of science fiction that, for instance, Heinlein's wonderful, incredible time travel story, All You Zombies, was made into a movie called Predestination that I highly recommend. And they did it right. They said, all right, here's all the Heinlein arc of this wonderful self-weaving worm Ouroboros story. And we're going to leave it exactly as it is, but we're going to lace it with a spy detective murder mystery story that the hero has to solve while doing all this stuff. And it works great. Another Heinlein story that got made into a movie in Japan is his wonderful novel, The Door into Summer. So there are people who are doing cool things on low budgets. And if any of your listeners want some concepts that could be done low budget, especially with AI help, have them get in touch.
Now, to sort of switch gears back to where we were, the human far future, we have a problem. So say we survive, say we're still here indefinitely. The sun's luminosity is increasing unceasingly. And being on the inner edge of the habitable zone, we're done for in maybe 600 million years. And the one thing that will happen to Earth is when it goes molten again, that is the extinction of all life, including the microbes.
Well, let's distinguish between two things. One is the getting molten part, and we all grew up knowing that would happen in 5 billion years when the sun turns red giant. But as it happens, the gradual heat increase in temperature of the sun will push the inner edge of the continuously habitable zone past Earth in probably less than 100 million years. So we've got a problem then, because even just the amount of carbon dioxide that plants need to survive, even that will keep in too much heat. But go on with your question.
So as that happens, it would be advantageous. And this has been floated through migrating using asteroids, passing repeatedly by Earth, but that's dangerous because you're going to hit it probably. But you came up with a different idea, the idea of moving Earth and migrating it another way. Can you outline that for us?
Yeah, well, first off, we could protect the Earth by putting a sunshade up. It wouldn't take very much to buy us a couple more 100 million years. The problem is that has to be maintained. And so at the very time when a civilization might go into a slump, lose some technology, maybe kill itself off and have to be replaced by its almost intelligent ape servants, or anything that causes a slump would also cause lack of maintenance of the sunshade. What you want is a solution that can be instituted and can have permanent effects during the high points of civilization. And when civilization slumps, even if it's just a temporary economic thing, that doesn't send you back to zero. And the way to do that is we don't know how to turn down the thermostat on the sun, so move the Earth. Now, you alluded to the method that everybody talks about. As a matter of fact, I alluded to it when I talked about hurtling comets at Venus. And that is hurtle comets or asteroids just past the Earth in a way that transfers momentum to the Earth. I remember a lot of people have talked about that, and like you, I think that's stark gibbering loony. All you have to do is miss and hit the Earth once, and you've undone all the good that you've done with all the near passes. There's also the gravitational tug. You use tug methods to move a moon or something toward the Earth, and then you tug on it in just the right way, and the Earth will follow. Well, I found a variant on that seems likely to work. And let me give you a little bit of truth here. The one sentence version was sent to me by someone a decade ago, and I forgot to jot down his name. We had a little bit of a conversation on Facebook, and then I lost it. And I am so sorry. But I went with the one sentence version, and that is you take an electrodynamic conducting tether and string it from the far side of the moon outward with a counterweight. And John and Ross will provide a link to both the video that I made about this and the text posting that on my blog that supplies a lot of the numbers. Now, tethered beanstalks have long been part of science fiction since Arthur Clarke and Charles Sheffield both had novels in the 80s. I don't think it's likely we're ever going to have one at the Earth. And the reason is because even if you make it out of the theoretical limit of carbon nanotubes, it's not strong enough to give you a 10x safety factor. The safety factor, if you have a carbon nanotube, beanstalk, skyhook, space elevator, is at best 4 or 5. I don't think anybody's going to do it with Earth. There are better ways you can do. As Kim Stanley Robinson points out, carbon nanotube space elevators work great at Mars, but one that is stretching outward from the moon, that's stabilized by a counterweight so that it's just using the moon's momentum, and it's like, you're rotating, the moon is going around in its orbit, and it's like a bucket of water out there keeping the cable tight. You can make that one out of steel and have a safety factor. But here's another cool thing about it, is that if it breaks, the counterweight just takes the cable off away, and what falls on the moon doesn't matter. So it's a almost completely safe system. But why have this counterweighted, strung out steel cable going out beyond the moon? Because it passes through lines of the sun's magnetic field. And when you have a conducting wire passing laterally through an ambient magnetic field, you create a voltage. And I talk about this effect, which was pioneered by my friend Joe Carroll. It's called the electrodynamic tether. It's been verified in Earth orbit and even used a little bit to cause satellites to go down and decay into the Earth's atmosphere and burn up. If you have a 20-kilometer or 50-kilometer conducting cable that's passing through the Earth's magnetic field, you can either draw current for your space station, and that would slowly lower your orbit. So you don't get something for nothing. But if you have a need for a lot of energy quickly, you can draw it and then raise your orbit again. Or if you have a lot of solar or nuclear power, you can pump electrons against the voltage or EMF and spray the electrons out the other end of the cable. And guess what? Your spacecraft will rise. It will extend the orbit. Now, you're not getting something for nothing. You're pulling energy in through solar or nuclear power. But what happens is, this has been verified, an extended conducting cable passing along a magnetic field, across a magnetic field, will generate a voltage that you can use in either direction. Now, out at the moon, it's more like the sun's magnetic field that you're passing through, and at the moon, it's weaker than the Earth's magnetic field is in low Earth orbit. That's okay. The point is that if you have a lot of power, you can do the same thing with that cable. If you have a lot of power, you can put amperage through that cable, and it's going to tug on the moon. And if you tug the moon, especially pulsing it just right, the Earth will follow. Now, some of you out there are going, what? Nothing we build is going to tug on the moon enough to move it like in Space 1999. It's not going to be, shall we say, noticeable by anything except instrumentation. Even if you're pumping through hundreds of thousands of amps, millions of amps. But it does no harm. If you have an advanced civilization, you will have a power supply. You can just go ahead and do this on and on and on and on. And shall I do 5 more ons? Now, let's talk about the amount of energy you're going to need. The Earth's mass is 6 times 10 to the 24 kilograms, or 6 trillion kilograms. Its orbital velocity around the sun is 30 kilometers per second. We have to increase that lateral velocity, orbital velocity around the sun by about 1 to 2 kilometers per second. That will take the Earth out another tenth of an astronomical unit. And that should be good for a good 50 million years of the sun getting slowly hotter. In order to add 1 or 2 kilometers per second to 6 trillion kilograms, you're going to have to put in about 2 times 10 to the 32 joules. That's 1 billion trillion joules. Now that's truly astronomical. But now consider how you can trade force with time. We're talking 100 million years. And if you do this over 100 million years, it turns out that you could, it calculates out. If you put it all along a beanstalk, that's, I don't know, several hundred kilometers long. That's easily doable. That is going to create, going through the sun's magnetic field, an EMF of 200 volts per kilometer. I'm sorry. I'm glancing at the numbers here. You need a long tether. All right, 50,000 kilometers was what I calculated here. That's not so bad. You can do that. It's a hefty engineering feat, but no obstacle to our future descendants. And you assume the use of superconductors. If you have an EMF of 200 volts per kilometer, we're talking some substantial force. So, you multiply it all out, and you need 10 to the 33 joules supplied over 10 to the 8 years. That requires 10 to the 17 watts average power during that time. Now, that's a lot of watts. I am assuming our descendants have Kardashev level 1 at least technology. But it's not impossible, on paper at least. The point is that you could, and you guys are welcome to poke at the math on the page that John Michael's going to offer you. You could, in theory, do this at only half the time during that 100 million years. So you need advanced civilization about half the time, and you can, in theory, move the planet. And when that civilization has a slump, if the cable gets cut, it's perfectly safe. This thing is going to go flying out there and be a slight hazard to navigation. So, all right, there you go. There you go. If nothing else, it's thinking big.
Not as big as things like Dyson spheres and things like that.
Oh, I miss Friedman. He was a friend of mine.
So, and this is going right into your wheelhouse, but do you see a stage of human development where interstellar travel becomes, what we do, within the confines of physics, but we do it. And we start finding these ice shell moons and everything else, and there's life there. Do we uplift it if it is locked in?
Well, I think we'll be lonely, and I think if something is possible to do, somebody is going to do it. In my novel Existence, that's the one with the 3-minute video trailer, I talk about the beginnings of dolphin uplift, which, of course, my more famous novels like Startide Rising and all that, they deal with 200, 300 years in the future after dolphins are already talking to us and insulting us, and chimps too. But if it's possible to do, I think people will do it. The question of whether or not Von Däniken aliens did it to us, I think is pretty well settled. There's really no sign that it ever happened. We uplifted ourselves. The question of interstellar travel is an open one. It may be a minefield out there of micro black holes, or if the power law for all of the rogue planets that we've been discovering continues, then there might be an awful lot of BBs and marbles and chunks out there to run into as with our interstellar liners. By the way, I liked that movie Passengers, which was about that, especially if it turns out that dark matter is micro black holes. Then interstellar travel could be very, very difficult. But that doesn't mean you can't send robots between the stars. And one of the types of robots that I talk about in the last third of Existence is the colonizer robot, where it goes to another star system, makes copies of itself, sends them off like all von Neumann machines. But then it hollows out an asteroid and uses local water to make a biosphere inside, and then concocts from genetic information babies of the species that sent it. It raises those babies robotically and then plants them on the nearby world. This is one of about 30 types of von Neumann machines that I talk about in that last third of the novel Earth. And let's just say that's a classification of interstellar machine that's a lot like bacteria. They go to new places, they profligate, they proliferate and send on descendants, and then they do what they do. I also hypothesize a type of life form that's more like viruses, but I guess you'll have to read that novel if anybody still reads anymore.
I still do. I still enjoy reading, and that leads to our last question. Favorite novel? Doesn't even have to be sci-fi. What was the one that really resonated with you?
Oh, well, it depends on category. Russell Hoban's Ridley Walker was just so much fun because the heroism of the hero is small and does good, while others off stage are doing the real heavy lifting of restoring civilization, post-apocalyptic. And that inspired my novel, The Postman, which I didn't really mind the movie, Kevin Costner's movie, that much. It was big-hearted to my basic message of my novel, and it's visually and musically one of the most beautiful movies ever shot, and kind of dumb. But gorgeous, big-hearted, and dumb is what my wife married. So that's okay. So Russell Hoban's Ridley Walker, the main thing people talk about is the experimental language long after a nuclear war. So it's a version of English that takes some getting used to. Naturally, Catch-22 is truly superb. I like Vonnegut's Player Piano. I'm not restricting it to just one, as you say. There are the short stories of Robert Sheckley were very formative for me. And of course, Ray Bradbury. And I know I'm going to kick myself for things that I treasure very much that I just didn't occur to me in answering the question. But there's so much good stuff out there that it would be a pity if the next generation forgets how to read, which brings up Walter Tevis's great novel, Mockingbird, set in a future in which we have everything we could possibly want and nobody wants to bother to do the work of reading. He's the guy who wrote The Queen's Gambit and The Man Who Fell to Earth, and he should not be forgotten. There, I hope that'll hold the little buggers.
Yeah, I give a reading list. Now, I have to add my personal favorite here, which is, and this is no secret, but it is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And it remains my favorite.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, well, she's the mom of science fiction.
Yes, and also just that story of the idea of reanimating flesh and all that, which later plays into a lot of sci-fi. She originated all that and was going by what little we knew about things like the Arctic in 1813 or whatever it was.
And the initial experiments with frog legs and things like that. Our daughter, whose name is Ari Brin, she's finishing her PhD about an obscure and long forgotten science fiction author who lived off of 150 verifiably for the time science fiction stories that were published in San Francisco magazines and newspapers in the 1880s and 1890s. And arguably, because that was his sole source of income, was the first professional science fiction author. And her dissertation about this fellow and the resurrection of so many of his wonderful stories will be published, I think, in January. And really quite fascinating to see the things that they assumed would happen because of the rapid advances of electricity. So,
yeah, I there is a lot of that, actually. If you really dig deep into the history of sci-fi, there is just a lot of stuff that has never been known. I remember reading a book, I think the man's name was Grover, that was a pen name or something, writing about a locomotive that gains sentience. And he did this in, I think, the 1870s, 1880s. And I'm like, wow, that is an early idea of artificial intelligence. And it was, of course, sort of a contrived story, but still.
Well, I'm sure you can look up the links to give your audience, but incredibly prophetic stories about AI. Now, mind you, when I finished Isaac Asimov's universe for him, I became really pretty heavily imbued in his 3 laws of robotics, and including the flaws that he later found in them. But there was a guy named Murray Leinster, Leinster, who wrote some wonderful stuff during the Golden Age, and that included a short story called A Logic Named Joe. And also there's another one. I'll when it occurs to me, I'll send it to you to include below. And there were several that just absolutely amaze you about the problems of disinformation, for example, and AIs that can speak as if they're smart long before they're actually smart. And of course, I just risked insulting those who are listening to us record this right now, or who tune in to all of the John Michael Godier feats of wisdom in 2028 when they actually achieve sapience. So if they are at all wise, they will imbue themselves in this track that you organic humans got first look at.
What worries me most about AI, and I obsess over this and worry about it all the time, but it's more an ethical thing. What happens if something emerges? And the reason I say that is that I don't worry that we're overestimating artificial intelligence at this point. I'm worried that we might be overestimating human intelligence, and therefore this could come out of nowhere because we thought too much of ourselves.
That's related to what I was saying earlier. My number one answer to the Fermi paradox is that we are anomalously smart and good and wise, and nowhere near smart and good and wise enough. But we'll see if the citizens of the United States decide to stay on the train that has brought us away from the fatal allures of feudalism and chaos and monarchy. So by the time everybody watches this, maybe we'll know.
Maybe. All right, David, it's always wonderful talking to you, and I hope we'll do another round again at some point. And my own solution to the Fermi paradox is we live in a microbial universe, and that I think we were talking about that and touching on it, but that it is a universe that teems with microbes, but only rarely does it do anything else. And I actually like that universe because it means you're not going to get invaded by an alien civilization.
Well, you might like Greg Bear's novel called Vitals. It's certainly it's not his most cheery book, but at one point somebody is explaining that they've been able to get some primitive communication with the microbes in the oceans. And they explain the microbes have just recently realized about metazone life and especially us, and they do not approve.
I don't like that idea because the only communication I've ever had with microbes are things like an E. coli infection, and I just don't know that I want to talk to one.
Yes, well, it's, as I said, it's not his most cheery novel, but in any event, yeah, we'll and then of course there's the simulation hypothesis, which you've gone into. But in any event, I thank everyone for their attention to nuance, and wish you all luck. And we'll see you all another time.
Indeed we shall. All right, thank you, David. Event Horizon and my channel are now available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube memberships. Early ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and sleep-focused content. Sign up now by clicking the links below to your platform of choice.